Good evening. This week we've heard from two people about definitions of poetry. From Weiss, we've heard that poetry is, quote, language in which every component, element, word and word order, sound and pause, image and echo is significant. Significant in that every element points towards or stands for further relationships among and beyond themselves. Poetry, therefore, is language that always means more. On the other hand, Zapruder writes in chapter 1, which you didn't read this week, and that's fine, titled Three Beginnings and the Machine of Poetry, that Ludwig Wittgenstein quotes, "Do not forget that a poem, although it is composed in the language of information, is not used in the language game of giving information." What does that mean? Well, he goes on to say that his own definition of poetry is along the lines of Emily Dickinson's line of thinking. That, therefore, poetry isn't necessarily something we can define. Instead, it is something we just know, that we know by its effect. Therefore, it's not giving us information, we are interpolating information. In the introduction in chapter 5 of Why Poetry, Zapruder seems to imply this by his obvious effort to avoid defining poetry at any costs. Now, if we look at this poem, or this piece of writing, I'll read it for you, but what do we see? We see a short paragraph and then 1, 2, 3 sentences afterwards, right? So the author writes, "What makes Argia different from other cities is that it has earth instead of air. The streets are completely filled with dirt. Clay packs the rooms to the ceiling. On every stair, another stairway is set in negative. Over the roofs of the houses hang layers of rocky terrain like skies with clouds. We do not know if the inhabitants can move about the city, widening the worm tunnels and the crevices where roofs twist. The dampness destroys people's bodies and they have scant strength. Everyone is better off remaining still, prone. Anyways, it is dark. From up here, nothing of Argia can be seen. Some say it's down below there, and we can only believe them. The place is deserted. At night, putting your ear to the ground, you can sometimes hear a door slam." Now, this comes from Italo Calvino's book, Invisible Cities, and it's titled Cities in the Dead 4. Is it poetry? Is it prose? Is it a prose poem? Do you ever read something in a book, something that isn't a poem, isn't labeled a poem, and consider it poetic? Calvino's works seem to defy easy categorization, and though in this book they seem to come in the form of prose poems, Invisible Cities has more often than not been labeled a novel, and in some cases a collection of short stories or poetry. But I'd like you to consider what it is to you. Define it through your own interpolations, through Weiss or through Zapruder. Is it poetry? I'm going to give you a second to think about that. Now, I just want to quickly go through the history of English poetry, all of it. Though we think of rhyme as one of the key ways to identify poetry for us, English poetry really has its origins in alliteration. In Romantic languages like French or Spanish, it is easy to rhyme because there are so many similar endings for words. Before the Normans, the French, conquered Britain in 1066, Old English was the language that was primarily spoken in that area. And it looked sort of like this language you can see on the right hand of the screen. This is now known as Middle English, and after the French conquered, words were slowly introduced into the English language that were adapted from the French language. Words like cottage as opposed to hut, mansion as opposed to house, rude as opposed to uncouth, liberty as opposed to freedom, or forest as opposed to woods. Now, especially because the French were the nobility at this time, and they therefore valued French as more proper and higher bred than the English language, rhyming French cognates became more common in English poetry. Then, in the mid-14th century, when the English were feeling especially patriotic, which is of course an extreme simplification, alliteration became popular again. Enter the Pearl poet, the unknown author of at least 3 poems, including this one, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. This phase was titled the alliterative revival, and it falls in the format of a pair of stressed syllables at the beginning of a line, a pause or caesura at the middle, and another pair at the end of the line. The alliterative lines sometimes only have 2 or 3 alliterations rather than 4, though. And the Pearl poet sometimes plays with this form even more than that, with including internal rhyming, for example. Now, I'm going to read this to you, and forgive me if it's a little bit difficult, but you can follow along on the right-hand screen, and then I will repeat the English version for you as well. So the Pearl poet writes, "And all graded in grene this gome and his wedes, a straight coat full streft, that stick on his sides, a merry mantle above, mensked within, with paler poured appeared, the panna full clean, with blithe bloner full breathed, and his hood bothe, that wats lapped fro his lokes and laid it on his shoulders, him well halled hose of that sam, that span it on his spear there, and clean spears under, of breathed gold, upon silk borders buried full riche, and skulls under shankes there the shelk readers." Now in English this says, "And all garbed in green, this giant and his gear, a straight coat full tight that stuck to his sides, a magnificent mantle above, masked within with pelts paired pertly, the garment agleam with blithe ermine full bright, and his hood both, that was left from his locks and laid on his shoulders. Neat, well-hauled hose of that same green that clung to his calves, and sharp spurs under of bright gold on silk stockings rich barred, and no shoes under sole, where the same rides." Note the adaptation of the alliteration and the Anglo-French words such as mantle and bloner, which means a type of fur, seen as in the English translation, ermine. Now, throughout this poem, the Pearl poet leans heavily on words that are derived from Old English, but it is nearly impossible, even in the 14th century, to take away that French influence. In addition to those Anglo-French words, there is also the use of the letter Z to pluralize a word, such as loques or locks, another example of this French influence. But what does it mean to know this, and what can we take away from it? Now, close reading comes in here. I am going to model this week what close reading is, and I'm going to be modeling an example of close reading every week for the rest of the class. Now, this week we'll be using the concept of alliteration, but next week we'll use some different concept. However, close reading still implies the same concept each time, a sustained interpretation of a brief passage of text. What can we learn then from this brief passage of text by reading through alliteration? Well, first of all, we've already learned a lot. We've learned about how poets in the 14th century played with an older tradition of alliteration in Old English to make it work for them. And we learned that the Pearl poet specifically seems to prioritize Old English cognates when possible. Except for those few examples that we talked about, most of the language in this section and the rest of the poem is derived from the Old English language. We can also look at a specific line of text to figure this out more closely. So we see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines in the line that wats lath fro his lokes and laid on his shoulders. Now, if we look at that, we can further consider this alliterative meaning. The lack of the usual alliterative pairing here, we only have 2 in the front half and 1 in the back half of the line. It brings an odd amount of attention to the word shoulders or shoulders. Knowing that in both this transcription and in the modern translation there's an ending punctuation, a semicolon you can see, we can probably guess the most obvious example. which is that the poet is moving on in the next line to a new trait or description, that of the green hose of the Green Knight. And when he does so, he doesn't actually use the word green, which means that we have to rely back on that first line, gravid and grin. This emphasis on the word shoulders first gives us that knowledge that the pearl poet is moving on to this new description, especially because the pearl poet probably didn't use a semicolon. That was probably put in there by the transcriptors and the translators thereafter. So when he then says that he is wearing that same in the next line, he's not referring to the ermine on the shoulders, but instead the green of the garments. He is also possibly, however, emphasizing the power of those shoulders. The upper body of a man is typically indicative of the power of that man, and when we find out later in the poem that those same shoulders will wield an immense amount of power in deciding the fate of Gawain's life, we can note that the poet here is making them stand out, much in the way that a man's tank top would emphasize his muscles, for example. The pearl poet wants us to know, that is, that the locks of hair laying on his shoulders, and the ermine that lays there as well, is clearly worth mentioning, but they are nothing to the power the man's body will hold later in the poem. Now, that's it for this week, but I'd like you to look to the framing document for your discussion prompts and to think about what you would like to prioritize for this week's close reading. I'm going to ask you to choose from these poems. They're all short, since we weren't required to do a reading, and I think all of them were somehow included in this week's materials, whether it was in this lecture or within some of the readings that we were assigned. Please also read the CR assignment closely before you begin the assignment and follow all the requirements, including how to format it. If you have any questions, you can ask me on Discord, or you can ask me in the chat feature of Canvas, and I look forward to hearing from you all about your discussions. See you next week.